In 1930, a photographer captured 4 men eating lunch on a beam 800 feet above Manhattan. No ropes, no nets, nothing but leather boots and a tin lunchbox between them and the street below. The image became an icon, but the truth behind it reveals something far more unsettling. These workers were not reckless. They had mastered a set of techniques so precise that standing on a 6-inch beam felt safer than trusting any harness of the era. How did ordinary men train their bodies to ignore every survival instinct? And why did the methods they invented still influence construction a century later? The skyscraper boom of the 1920s and the 1930s created a new kind of worker. These were not the masons and carpenters of earlier generations, bound to solid ground and heavy scaffolding. Iron workers, as they came to be called, inhabited a vertical world where the rules of ordinary labor simply did not apply. On the rising frames of the Chrysler Building and the Empire State, men walked narrow beams hundreds of feet above the pavement, with nothing beneath them but open air. The job attracted a particular breed. Many came from backgrounds where physical risk was already part of life. Mohawk iron workers from Kanawake, near Montreal, became legendary for their steadiness at height. Immigrant laborers from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe filled out the ranks, drawn by wages that could reach $8 a day, nearly double what a factory hand might earn. But money alone did not explain the willingness to step onto a beam at 70 stories. The work required a kind of adaptation that went beyond courage. New men on the job often froze in their first days, gripping columns with white knuckles while veterans strolled past. Foremen watched for signs of panic. A man who could not move freely was a danger to himself and everyone around him. Those who survived the first weeks began to change. The body learned to read the beam underfoot, to sense the slight flecks of steel under weight, to anticipate the sway of the frame in a gust of wind. Balance became instinct, not calculation. Height itself stopped registering in the usual way. Workers described a kind of tunnel vision that set in after the first 100 feet. The street below became abstract, a distant pattern of movement that no longer triggered the usual fear response. Psychologists studying vertigo would later note that repeated exposure to heights can dampen the brain's alarm signals, allowing skilled workers to operate in conditions that would paralyze an untrained person. On the high steel, this adaptation was not optional. It was the price of admission. The absence of safety equipment was not mere oversight or bravado. Harnesses available in the 1920s were heavy, awkward, and poorly suited to the demands of ironwork. Leather belts weighed as much as 10 pounds and restricted movement at the hips. Hemp rope lanyards frayed quickly against sharp steel edges and could snag on rivets or bolts at the worst possible moment. Workers who tried using belts often found themselves tangled, off balance, or jerked sideways by their own safety line. The physics of the job made every restriction dangerous. Connecting a beam required reaching, twisting, and leaning far out over empty space. A worker might need to stretch his full body length to guide a swinging load into position, then pivot instantly to drive a drift pin through a bolt hole. Any gear that slowed these movements or threw off balance could turn a routine task into a fatal mistake. Veterans quickly learned that freedom of movement was their best protection. Instead of relying on equipment, iron workers developed a repertoire of technique passed down through apprenticeship and observation. The most important was footwork. Walking a beam was not a matter of placing one foot in front of the other. Workers learned to keep their weight centered, their knees slightly bent, their eyes fixed on a point ahead rather than on the drop below. The heel and toe method, stepping with the heel first and rolling forward onto the ball of the foot, gave maximum contact with the steel and allowed quick adjustments in response to wind or vibration. Balancing on a beam also meant reading the structure itself. Steel frames were not rigid. They swayed in the wind, flexed under the weight of hoisted loads, and vibrated with the rhythm of riveting gangs working floors below. Experienced workers could feel these movements through the soles of their boots and adjust their stance accordingly. A sudden gust might push a man 6 inches off his line. The ability to absorb that shift without overcorrecting was what separated veterans from newcomers. When reaching or leaning was required, workers used a technique called heeling. By hooking one heel over the edge of a beam and bracing the opposite foot against a column or rivet head, a man could extend his body far into open space while keeping his center of gravity anchored. This allowed for controlled, stable reaches that no harness of the era could match. The angle of the ankle, the tension in the calf, and the counterbalance of the free arm all worked together to hold the body steady. Even slight interference from a belt or rope could disrupt this delicate equilibrium. Hands were never idle. Workers gripped columns, grabbed taglines, and steadied themselves against any available surface. Gloves were rarely worn because bare skin gave better feedback. The texture of steel, the temperature of a rivet head, the tension in a rope all provided information that could mean the difference between a safe move and a slip. Iron workers developed calluses thick enough to grip hot metal and rough enough to hold onto oily beams in the rain. Communication on the high steel was a language unto itself. The roar of steam engines, the clatter of pneumatic riveters, and the constant din of city traffic made spoken words nearly useless above the first few floors. Crews relied on hand signals, whistles, and visual cues to coordinate their movements. A flat palm meant stop. A raised fist signaled danger overhead. A quick wave to the left or right told the hoist engineer which way to swing a load. The signalman was the linchpin of every operation. Positioned where he could see both the load and the workers on the beam, he relayed instructions with crisp, exaggerated gestures. Only the signalman communicated with the hoist operator. No one else was permitted to give commands. This discipline prevented the chaos that could result from conflicting orders and kept the focus on the man with the clearest view. Taglines, ropes tied to the ends of hoisted beams, gave workers a way to guide heavy loads into position. Pulling a tagline required strength and timing. Too much tension could swing the beam off course. Too little left it at the mercy of the wind. Workers learned to read the movement of a load the way a sailor reads a sail, adjusting their pull in response to every shift and gust. When a beam finally settled into place, the men holding the lines could feel the moment of contact through their hands. Riveting gangs worked in teams of 4, each man with a specific role. The heater tended a small coal forge, pulling rivets from the fire at the precise moment they reached cherry red. The catcher, crouched on the beam, snagged the thrown rivet in a tin bucket and jammed it into the waiting hole. The bucker-up braced a heavy steel bar against the factory head, holding the rivet steady. The riveter drove a pneumatic gun against the glowing shank, flattening it into a permanent dome in a matter of seconds. This sequence repeated hundreds of times a day, rivet after rivet, connection after connection. The pace was relentless. A single gang could drive more than 500 rivets in a shift, the rhythm of their work echoing across the frame. Each rivet had to be driven before it cooled. If it lost its heat, it was knocked out and the process started again. The coordination required was extraordinary. A missed catch or a slipped bar could send a red-hot rivet tumbling into the city below. The buddy system was an unwritten rule enforced by tradition and necessity. No one worked alone on the high steel. Every task, from walking a beam to guiding a load, was performed with a partner nearby. If a man froze, lost his footing, or simply needed a hand, someone was always close enough to help. This mutual reliance created bonds that went beyond ordinary friendship. Workers trusted their partners with their lives, and that trust was earned through shared risk. Apprentices learned by watching, listening, and absorbing the habits of veterans. Formal training was rare. Instead, new men were paired with experienced workers who taught them to read the steel, interpret signals, and move with the rhythm of the crew. Lessons were delivered in real time, often at heights where a mistake meant more than a scolding. The knowledge passed down this way was practical, hard-won, and specific to the conditions of each job site. The dangers were constant and unforgiving. Falls claimed more lives than any other hazard. A misstep, a gust of wind, a moment of inattention could send a man plummeting to the street. Contractors quietly accepted a grim calculation: one death for every $1 million spent on a major project. Official records often undercounted the toll, but the iron workers themselves kept track. Widows' funds, established by unions, collected donations from the pockets of survivors to support families left behind. Falling objects were nearly as deadly as falls. Tools, rivets, and pieces of steel could slip from a worker's grasp and plunge hundreds of feet, gaining enough speed to kill anyone below. Hard hats were not standard until the late 1930s. Workers relied on vigilance and the constant awareness of what was happening overhead. The shout of a dropped tool could send men scrambling for cover, but not everyone heard it in time. The Woolworth Building, completed in 1913, was one of the first projects to expose the full scale of these risks. At 792 feet, it demanded new methods and new levels of coordination. Wind at that height could reach gale force without warning. Beams swung wildly on their hoists, and workers learned to time their movements to the gusts. On days when the wind climbed above 40 miles per hour, all work stopped. No amount of skill or courage could overcome the physics of a 2-ton beam swinging free in a storm. The Empire State Building, rising at a pace of more than a floor a day in 1930 and 1931, pushed the limits even further. More than 3,400 workers swarmed the site at its peak, threading beams, swinging hammers, and guiding rivets into place. The official death toll was 5, though rumors and union records suggested the true number was higher. Each loss was felt deeply by the crews, but the pace never slowed. The building had to be finished on schedule, and the men on the steel kept climbing. The culture of the high steel was shaped by pride, tradition, and a code of mutual responsibility. Refusing to wear a harness was not just about comfort or practicality. It was a statement of identity. A man who reached for a belt too quickly might be labeled a coward, a word that could end a career as surely as a fall. The Brotherhood demanded toughness and self-reliance. Workers policed their own, pushing out those who could not meet the standard. Mohawk ironworkers, in particular, carried a legacy that extended back generations. Families in Kanawake sent sons and grandsons to the high steel, passing down stories of bridges and towers built by their ancestors. To show fear or to rely on equipment was to risk shaming not just oneself, but an entire lineage. This sense of honor kept men moving forward, even when common sense urged caution. Change came slowly. The passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act in 1970 marked a turning point. For the first time, federal law required fall protection for workers above a certain height. Inspectors could fine companies, shut down job sites, and hold foremen accountable for violations. The old arguments about pride and experience no longer carried weight in court. Technology caught up with regulation. New harnesses, built from lightweight synthetic webbing with shock-absorbing lanyards and multiple attachment points, spread the force of a fall across the chest, shoulders, and thighs. These designs, inspired in part by military parachute gear, weighed less than half as much as the old leather belts and moved with the worker instead of against him. By the late 1970s, full-body harnesses were standard on every major job site. Resistance lingered among veterans. Some refused to wear the new gear, seeing it as an insult to their skill. But the younger generation adopted the harnesses without complaint, viewing them as just another tool. Safety became a matter of compliance, not personal choice. The era of working without protection, built on improvisation and nerve, was ending. Today, every ironworker on a commercial job site is required to tie off above 6 feet. Self-retracting lifelines, anchor points, and rescue plans are part of the daily routine. Trainers often begin their sessions with a nod to the men who built the skyline without modern equipment, honoring the skill and sacrifice that made the rules necessary. The stories of the old crews are not forgotten. They are woven into the culture, a reminder of what the work once demanded. The towers that still stand over Manhattan are monuments to that era. Every beam, every rivet is a record of human ingenuity and risk. The men who walked the high steel without harnesses did not see themselves as daredevils. They were craftsmen, trained to a standard that left no room for error. Their legacy is written in steel and in the safety codes that protect every worker who follows. Progress, it turns out, is not just about what we build. It is about what we learn from those who built before us. What risks do we still take for granted? Share your thoughts below.